Hey folks, this is going to be a video on section 1.4. It's actually going to be split into several shorter videos so that it's a little bit easier to manage and you can go through and only watch what you need to, excuse me, if you are reviewing the concepts. All right, so this first video in section 1.4, let's just introduce the concept of quadratic equations. So notice here that a quadratic equation is going to look like this right here. Ax squared plus bx plus c is equal to 0. A, B, and C are going to be real numbers. This is called the standard form. A quadratic equation is going to be a second degree equation. Degree refers to the highest power. So since the highest power is going to be 2, this is going to be a second degree equation. Now let's talk about several different methods of solving quadratic equations. The first method is going to be called the zero factor property. You may have heard of this in several different ways. It might be called the zero product property. It might just be called solving by factoring. So there's several different ways that you might have heard this referred to. So the zero factor property is where when A and B are complex numbers, and when I multiply them, they're equal to 0, then what I know about that is that either A has to be 0 or B has to be 0, or both have to equal 0. So we're going to use that concept. So in example number 1, when it says to use the zero factor property to solve this, the very first thing we have to do is factor. So by the time you get to this course, you should be familiar with factoring. So this is not a video on how to factor. This is just simply a video on using factoring to solve the quadratic equation. So when we factor this trinomial 10x squared plus x minus 2, then we're going to have the binomial 5x minus 2 quantity times the quantity 2x plus 1. So our very first step then is to factor. Now, using what we just read up here, notice that I have the product of two binomials. So, and this product is equal to 0. So if the product is equal to 0, then one of the two has to equal 0. So we'll set up two mini equations. The first one is going to be 5x minus 2 is equal to 0, and the second one is going to be 2x plus 1 is equal to 0. And we can solve these two little mini equations. So we'll add 2 and divide by 5, and on the other one, we will subtract 1 and divide by 2. So our two solutions then are going to be x is equal to 2/5 or x is equal to negative 1/2. So that's solving by using the zero factor property. The second method of solving is called the square root property. Now, the square root property is when you have something squared is equal to a number k. So what we know then is that we can take the square root of both sides, but when we take the square root of both sides, we have to remember to include in here a positive or a negative version. And so x is going to equal to the square root of k, or x is going to equal to the negative square root of k. Now this can either be written separately like you see here, or we can abbreviate it to write it all in one using that positive or negative. So for example 2 then, what we see is we have x squared. We need to get rid of the square so that we can solve. Solve means get the variable alone. And so we're going to square root both sides, but just remember, anytime you square root both sides, you've got to include the plus or minus. And so what we have then is that x is equal to positive or negative square root of 29. And that can't be broken down any further because 29 is a prime number. When we go to part B, we take the square root of both sides. Don't forget your pos neg. The square root of a negative we know is I, and the square root of 144 is going to be 12. So we have a positive or negative 12i. X is equal to my solution. I have two solutions here. They're both imaginary solutions, and they're equal to pos or neg 12i. All right, same concept here. Let's take the square root of both sides. Anytime you take the square root of both sides, don't forget your positive or negative. So then on the left side, we have just a plain old x minus 8 because squares and square roots undo each other. On the right side, we have a pos or neg, square root of 24, but we know that 24 can break down into a 4 times a 6 because 4 is a perfect square. And so then we'll continue, we'll add 8 to both sides, and we will at the same time clean up that square root. So we'll have then our x value is equal to 8 plus or minus 2 square root 6. And once again, that 2 came from the square root of 4 is the same thing as 2. All right, so that's going to be the end of this first short video. Stay tuned for a video on completing the square next.